Hey everybody, Nick here, and today I got a review for you of this moderately sized guy right here. This is the Brad Southard Avo knife. Or Avo, or maybe it's short for avocado, I don't know. But whatever it is, it's a very interesting knife, and I want to thank my viewer John for sending this guy along. One thing I want to highlight, though, this has got an aftermarket blasting on it. The original blasting is a little bit darker, and this is not so much. So, yeah, just keep that in mind, that the finish is different here, but the rest of the knife is largely stock from what I can tell. So that's nice. Next thing I gotta say is that this is a part of Brad Southard's Performance series, I believe is what he calls it on the website, but they're basically a small batch production, mid-techy sort of thing. I gather that Brad Southard is assembling these, but the parts are made elsewhere, something along those lines. But whatever it is, you buy them predominantly through Brad or through some resellers. And let's do a size comparison here. See right here, this is the Ontario Rat number 1 and the Ontario Rat number 2. This right here is a Chris Reeve Knives Large Shabazz in the Insingo blade shape. Of course, your Spyderco Delica is a size comparison. And, you can see that this is not a huge knife particularly, but it's also not tiny. It's someplace in the middle there. And here's your Spyderco PM2, which is another good point of comparison here. So anyways, that's the size. Let's go on ahead and jump into the good, the great, the bad, and the ugly of the Brad Southard Avo. Okay, so on the good side, first off, actually Brad Southard himself has impressed me greatly, in that after I posted my review of another of his Midtech knives, the Tolk, which it was a fairly critical review. I mean, most of mine are, but still. It had an action issue, and he posted in a reply to the video, which takes some stones, very, very cordially, hey, I'm sorry to hear you had this problem. It's good to see, it's good to hear the negatives as well. If you or your viewer want that knife to get a look taken at it, just send it my way. That was about as good as anyone can possibly do in responding to a review, and he really earned some points in my book. So Brad's got some good built up there. Definitely the best of all the makers who've commented. Next thing, I love the maker's mark. It's a little detailed, but it's a detail I love. Next thing, the blade on this guy is nice. It's got a very, very nice sort of overall shape to it. It's got some flat, it's got some belly. The drop point isn't too terribly murdery. This is just a really nice utility cutting blade. For whatever reason, it feels a little bit like the Insingo blade on the Chris Reeve Knives Shabazz. Even in thickness and whatnot, it's a nice little blade shape. Can't argue with that. And the steel is CTS B75P. This is a bit of a zebra. You don't see it all that often. However, it seems to be a-okay here. I haven't used it very much, but chemically it's in the neighborhood of CPM 154 and S35VN, and pretty much everybody I've found agrees that it's good to go. So it's good to go. There's no problem with the steel. Next thing, some of the details are very nice on this guy in terms of just overall function. It's got very nice lock bar tension, just that perfect feeling of, yeah, I just moved it over, it's happy now. Zero lock stick, none of that. It's got very nice ergonomics overall. There's one complaint I'll make later on, but it's not a huge one. This feels nice in the hand, and it feels like a good tool in your hand as you're using it. And that's not something that's true of every knife, most absolutely 100%. It's also got a very nice blade-to-handle ratio. Speaking of that nice blade, you can see that the blade tucks all the way into the end there, and as a result, this feels a little bit bigger on the inside, relative to some of your other items out there. I like very much that feeling, and it's nicely done in that way. Next thing I got to comment on. One of the biggest issues I had with the Tolk was the thumb studs, actually. Thumb studs were right in the middle of the slicing path. On this knife, there are no thumb studs, which is a beautiful, beautiful thing. You can open this guy by the flipper or by pinching it open in this way, but either way, you don't have to worry about that, and it's beautifully implemented here. Always nice to see those four gone. Next thing I gotta say is that it is a relatively simple knife, and that's a beautiful thing. Right here, you've got a pivot, and then you've got these two screws in the back, each of which goes into a little standoff there. That's really it. And so there's not all that much to go wrong. There's also a lock bar stabilizer, but those take care of themselves by and large. And I'm always a big fan of relatively simple designs. There's nothing so fancy. It's on bearings. There's an internal stop pin, but that's about as fancy as it gets. And I appreciate very much that it's not all that fancy in that way. The machining on this guy, however, is a little bit fancier than it could have otherwise been, and I appreciate that. You can see that the knife has actually been contoured in places. It's a little thicker in the middle, and, you've got some nice details in terms of that. The contouring here is artistically done. It's not just, for instance, the contouring on the Shabazz here is relatively vanilla. You just put a chamfer on there, but here he's really tried to make a statement with it, and I think it works nicely. Very pretty in that way. Fits nicely in the hand with these contours, a little bit swollen in the areas. The over-travel stop is nicely machined and nicely done. Looks like a little Viking shield, that's the sound Vikings make, apparently. And the standoffs on it are even nice. And then finally, the last thing I got to comment on is the action. I gave the Tolk some heck for that because it really did have a subpod detent, but this one is A-okay. It's got a very nice working detent. It's not too super hard. It's not too super soft. It's just right in the middle there. I can flip it reliably without any kind of wrist. Absolutely okay. And the closing on it is not, again, it's not a super drop-shutty showpiece, but it's absolutely fine for a working tool. And it's worlds above that Tolk that I'd handled, which makes me optimistic that maybe that was a lemon, as Brad was implying, rather than endemic to Southern knives. So there you go. That's you good. It's nicely machined. It's got a nice action. It's a simple thing done well. It's got good ergonomics. It's got a good blade to handle. No thumb studs. Beautiful thing. The blade is good. The steel is fine. The maker's mark is excellent, and Brad himself is pretty cordial, at least responded to that last review. So there you go. Let's talk about what's great here. So for me, what's great about this knife is actually just that it felt like a very nice companion and tool as I was carrying this. That's kind of hard to evaluate. It's not like I can point to one individual thing, but it's just very nicely designed as an everyday carry tool. And I mean that in a few ways. It's not all that thick. I mean, thickness-wise, it's thinner than, for instance, your Rat 2, and it's, it's way thinner than, say, your Medford Marauder here, but that doesn't take much. It's also relatively lightweight. You're looking at, I believe, 4.2 ounces. Let's take a look-see here, shall we? Yeah, 4.21 ounces, which is right in the middle of the road. It's got enough substance that it feels nice in the hand, but it's not so heavy that it's problematic. It's relatively small in the pocket. I mean, if you take a look at this guy in the pocket, it's one sort of smooth and relatively narrow mass. Your hand can slide right by here. The pocket pecker is rounded off. Flip-a-tab is rounded off a little bit. It's nicely done in that way. It gives you the 3.5-inch blade in a relatively small package, which I appreciate. And then to top it all off, it's nice as an actual cutting tool. Sure, the blade stock could be a little thinner if you need something slicey, but every time I carried this, I felt like, wow, this is a really nice tool. It served me very well. That's hard to kind of put an exact, but it just feels like a very nice tool, whereas some knives feel much more like they've compromised some element of the being a pocket tool in favor of something that's a little bit more jewelry, a sculpture. This really has that same almost Shabazz-y feeling of just, this is something that you use to cut things, and it's very well designed for that. So a little amorphous, but that's what's great to me, is that this just feels like a great tool to carry with you on a regular basis. Let's talk about what's bad. So on the bad side, first off, this guy is not always available. They are kind of intermittently made. This is the nature of Midtech, a small batch production sorts of knives. Sometimes they're around, sometimes they're not. At the time I'm filming this review, you can't get them new through Brad, but I suspect they'll come back around, and you can usually find one on the secondary market if you're willing to pay a little bit of a price for them. But anyways, that can be a little bit of a disadvantage. You can't just necessarily call up your Blade HQ or your Knife Center or whatever and get something that's exactly what you need. Such is life. Next thing, as you saw in the disassembly video, it is a little bit fiddly to get centered. This is not a huge deal. I was able to do it. You just need to lock the pivot down and then lock down your back spaces. But compared to knives that make it absolutely effortless, like something like your Shabazz, your Norseman, that sort of an affair, that's a little bit striking, and that's the only real issue I've got on the fit and finish with this guy at all. Next thing, some people do love thumb studs. This doesn't have them. Like I said, I consider that to be good, but for you, that may be a problem, especially if you're not in love with flippers, or you really prefer some other non-flipper, slower method to get this guy open, other than two-hand open like that. Then finally on the bad side, actually not quite finally, second to finally, the price on this guy is up there. You're looking at $425 for this, and that's pretty pricey, and especially when you compare it to the high-end production knives you can find on the market from companies like your ZT, your Spyderco, etc. Absolutely, this is expensive. But the thing is, the quality is pretty damn good. It is made by a well-known maker, and it is maker-made, is the best of my understanding. And, you know, I think this is a very nicely made tool, so it doesn't bother me particularly. It's a lot of cash, but it's not, I don't feel like I'm getting my face ripped off here. They're doing everything by and large right, with two exceptions that we'll get to in a second here. But nonetheless, so the price is definitely high, but it doesn't feel terrible, and especially given that you're in the same ballpark as a large Shabazz, it doesn't bug me so much. Then finally, on the bad side, the blade does feel a little bit far from the hand as you're holding it, because there's this whole gap here between the sharpened portion of the blade and your hand. I kind of really do wish that there was a finger choil ground in here, because I think it would add another very compelling grip to this, and it would address the next problem here in the ugly. So we'll go there in a second, but that's the bad. The blade feels a little bit far from your hand as you're using it. The price is high, but not completely out of line. It lacks thumb studs. That'll bug some people. It can be a little fiddly to center, and they're only intermittently made. Let's get to that ugly. Two ugly things here. First off, the only thing that was really non-joyous about carrying this knife is the clip, because the clip has very little clearance. You can see here that the little over-travel stop sticks up a little bit, and the clip is right above it. And this basically has the consequence that you've got like a millimeter, or maybe a millimeter and a half of space between the clip and this little thing, which means that if you're wearing pockets with any kind of thickness, you're going to be battling to get this into your pocket. I'd like to see this ramp tweaked up a little bit more, and in fact, if I owned this knife, I would probably try and make that bend myself. But I would also perhaps like to see the clip either a little longer or a little shorter, so it's not interfering as much with this over-travel stop, or even just flatten that guy out. But either way, that's a little bit ugly, and that is something I hope they fix in a future run. Then, finally, the really ugly thing here is the bottom of this blade. It's got a really nasty issue with the sharpening at the end there. There are many solutions for how to get the blade sharp to the very end. One of the common ones is to use a sharpening choil, something like, let's see here. Right here on this Chris Reeves Shabazz that's handy, you can see that, well, the edge of the blade, the plunge grind drops down here and it's sharpened all the way over to here. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Although there is something that looks like a sharpening choil, the plunge grind is way past it. And so as a result, you end up with this ugly, completely unsharpened portion at the back here. The other approach is just to take it as close as you can to the edge and do what you can with it, like on the PM2 here. And unfortunately, that wasn't done here either. Instead, what we see is that the edge goes, and then kind of abruptly fishtails out and crashes and just stops. And that's really ugly, to the extent where I found myself Google image searching just to make sure that other ones were built like that this wasn't just an issue. So that really does need to be fixed. The sharpening choil is not covering it, and it's kind of badly recovered from even in that sense. So this choil needs to be extended, or a better solution needs to be found, because as it's done here, that's really, really ugly. And that's the biggest thing that's unbecoming a knife of this kind of price point. So there you go. That's what's ugly. The clip doesn't have quite enough clearance with the over-travel stop there. And the end part of the sharpening there just didn't go so well. So let's talk final conclusions here. Final conclusions, this is a very simple and honestly very nice knife. It feels much nicer for EDC than, say, the Tolk, although the Tolk had the nice feeling of little huge knife. But it's kind of hard to describe, but this knife has a really strong sense of a work tool, of honest, sort of very boring in the very best of ways. It just works. It's just a great tool. It's got that sort of Shabazz-esque feeling of just like, this is a knife that's designed to cut things and then go back into your pocket once it's done. And in that way, it has grown on me a lot more. Day one, when I kind of picked this guy up, it was just like, what the heck do I care about? It's not a flashy knife. It doesn't jump out at you. It's not a showpiece for action. You're never gonna, the action's good, but it's not like, oh my God. It's not going to blow anybody away when you set it down at the table at Blade Show. It's a solid, good little tool. And, it's kind of weird to feel this kind of solid, sturdy little tool thing about a knife that's $425 and running on bearings, but I still feel it rather strongly. It's kind of got that, I keep doing the Shabazz comparison almost beside myself with it, but it's got that flipper Shabazz feeling. It's weird, but that's kind of where I land on it. But, so in terms of final conclusions, look, the clip needs to be tweaked, absolutely, and the sharpening at the base of the blade here is a wreck and needs to be addressed. A sharpening choil or something needs to be done so that this little train wreck down here isn't occurring. But those are fixable details for the next run. You tweak the clip, you do the blade right, and problem freaking solved. And so, I guess the final conclusion here is that if you're after a flashy knife, if you're after a really fancy knife, you're after a showpiece, something you drop on the table and everybody goes, "Whoa!" This isn't really what you're going to be going for. But if you want a nice solid tool, a flipper knife that's sturdy, well-made, and overall pretty decent, and you see that those issues have been fixed, then I really do think you should check this guy out. It did impress me, and I did enjoy carrying it for the time I had it. So there you go. I hope that this has been interesting for you, and that you have yourselves a wonderful rest of the day, and that I've been an effective advocate for this knife. Okay, I tried. Anyways, have a good one. Bye now.